I'm sorry, I'm very, very sorry to have kept you all waiting. This is perhaps the only time in my life that I've walked directly into an event from the airport, and I'm sorry, I recognize...
Hi.
Hello. Should I just plunge right in? I'm so sorry to have kept you waiting. Poetry must be becoming important, because we almost mowed down about 3 or 4 people on the way, all in the cause of poetry. So there must be hope for the form. You know, I asked myself when I was first asked by Mr. Malik to offer an informal exchange, to have an informal talk with you. I asked myself whether I really want what I would like to talk about. And it seemed a bit odd to be proposing a defense of poetry when one is in the precincts of a library, which is presumably replete with books of poems. It also seems a bit strange to be talking about poetry when one is actually on the eve of a South Asian Poetry for Peace festival that's happening in this city. So I asked myself whether this was really worth it, whether I ought to be talking about something else. The reason that eventually clinched it was the fact that literary festivals now just seem to be a dime a dozen. In India alone, we have almost 50 festivals, perhaps more. In the subcontinent as well, because I was in Dhaka last month. It's wonderful to be here in one of my favorite cities this month for yet another. And suddenly poets also seem to be a little in demand. It's been kind of interesting to watch poets appear at festivals, network a little, flash business cards, engage in a little I'll write your review, you write mine kind of barter. It's a bit strange, but on the other hand, suddenly it seems like poets may actually be finding their place with the sun. And yet it's not true, because none of this translates into more books of poetry being published in the subcontinent. Certainly none of the major mainstream publishers have a regular poetry agenda. So books of poetry are few and far between as far as publishers go. Readers seem to still be few and far between. Buyers are definitely few and far between. Royalty checks for poets are non-existent. And there's even recent American research that I read about, which I hope is untrue, but which claims that poets actually die sooner than other species of writers. And that kind of sealed it. It seemed like it was a dismal predicament, really. For most of us who grew up, I think, writing poetry in English in the 90s, 80s and 90s in India, a question we were often asked is, why on earth poetry? If you have a certain dexterity with language, the invariable question is, why not the novel? Or at least, yes, write poetry, but you know, when is your first novel going to come out? The implicit assumption being poetry is the adolescent form. You graduate from the adolescent form to what really counts, which is this glamorous, high-profile, highly visible genre, the novel. Poetry is what you do when you're 16 and you want to write things in blood and send them off to someone who's jilted or loved you and jilted you or whatever. It's the kind of thing you do when your emotional thermostat is a bit not something you do when you're into your adulthood. So what I thought I would just share with you very briefly, because I know you've been an extraordinarily patient audience, I thought I'd just share 5 moments that for me have been significant in terms of my understanding, in terms of my reclaiming of poetry for myself. And I'm just hoping that that will strike a chord somewhere for some of you, and maybe there will be time for a conversation, or maybe that's being optimistic, I don't know. I hope there will be. But 5 moments, that's all I'd like to share with you. And I promise I'm not going to say poetry needs to be rescued, we need to perform this heroic act of pulling poetry out of the doldrums, because poetry is not an endangered animal. We are. It's not poetry that needs rescuing, we do. And that's really what I'd like to share with you. 5 moments. look back on my first encounters with poetry, and I suspect it's similar for many of us, emerging into a kind of verbal universe somewhere around 2 and 3. And I remember the sounds of little bits of doggerel in Tamil, which was the language I grew up with. I remember lots of nonsense verse in Hindi. I remember nursery rhymes in English. And I mention all of this here because none of these languages made any sense to me at all at that time. There were just fragmentary glimpses of meaning, and it seemed more than enough. I realized then, and I look back now, when people often talk about the fact that poetry seems like a difficult or challenging form, I often go back personally to this time when one knew one was in the province of mystery, because almost all the world was mysterious at this point, and it didn't matter. It just didn't matter. Because this seemed to be language that was capable of diving and swooping and careening and plummeting and soaring, doing all kinds of things that conversation just didn't seem to do. When I heard adults talk to each other, it seemed like this was language that walked. Whereas when you heard rhymes, when you heard poetry, it seemed like this was language capable of dance. This was language that was capable of going from point A to point B, to point D perhaps, but just taking a leap from one point to the other. That magic is something that I remind myself of today. Because a question that we're invariably asked as poets who write in English in India, and perhaps that's true for many of you here as well, is why are you writing in English? And I often respond, I respond in different ways. I've sometimes responded with kind of acerbic poems, but I think most of the time I just respond by saying, my first encounters with poetry were in fact proof to me that one didn't need to understand language entirely, one didn't need to be able to decode a poem entirely in order to love it. And that brings me to my second moment, which happened when I was about 7 or 8. I remember looking over my father's shoulder when he was reading the newspaper and discovering this line that said, "Got split over aluminium." I had no clue what it meant. But I liked the kind of sound of aluminium, and I felt if I stretched it in different ways, it could sound interesting, it could sound... I thought there were tonalities possible here. I don't even think I asked what that phrase meant. I just spent the day tasting that phrase, chewing it a bit, sipping it a little, gargling it a bit. And by the end of the day, I had made it mine. And I mentioned this as well here because this was my first realization that if you were to take language out of one context, throw it into another, and you dim the house lights a bit, turn on a spotlight, and throw it up in the air, language comes alive. Language just turns magical. It was my first encounter with the fact that there are in fact 2 kinds of language. I was always being asked, much later, I have been asked, I continue to be asked, why English? The assumption being English is the outside language, your home language, your inner language has to be something else. There has to be a single mother tongue. That's often the implicit assumption. And my answer to that actually is, I was aware of 2 kinds of language, but it wasn't an inside and outside language as much as I realized that there is terrestrial language and there is aerial language. There is mundane language and there is magical language. There is language that seems to be tethered to the earth, and the other that seems to be aquatic, aerial, all sorts of things. And I think that distinction between weekday language and holiday language was the distinction that I really picked up. And it was so clear that poetry was the province of the latter. I began to discover also that if you apply great heat and pressure to language, its chemical properties change. That for me was an exhilarating realization. That to me was what poetry was capable of. It was pressure cooker language. you could compress, distill, and at the end of it you were either more acidic or more alkaline, but you had changed. It was again a realization that poetry was actually, language, when it was used in poetry, is a chemical. And I think, in a strange, inarticulate way, this was something I was aware of, as I suspect again many of us are. This was something I was aware of at 7 or at 8. Then comes the third moment. It happened when I was around 12, I think, maybe 13. I was in my grandfather's home in Chennai, Madras, and it was one of those long, lazy, hot afternoons. And I remember pulling down a book from his bookshelf, and it was by someone called T.S. Eliot, and I had no clue who that was. I didn't know if it was male or female. I had no idea that this was someone one had to be reverent and weak in the knees about as some kind of messiah of modernism. I knew nothing, really. I just started leafing through the book. And of course, I wouldn't have been able to explain what I had read. But I knew, in this really thrilling and irrefutable way, that I was in the presence of poetry. I couldn't have decoded it, but I recognized it. I couldn't have explained it, but I certainly understood it. On some deep, visceral level, I had understood it. And so when people often say, poetry seems just too difficult, which is something that comes up at poetry workshops a great deal. Lots of people say, but why is it so challenging? This is again something I come up with because it for me is a reminder, a very empowering reminder, that every one of us is capable of responding to poetry. You respond to it even before you understand it at times, but we all respond to it. I'm not sure how poetry is taught nowadays, but in my time in school, there was what I call the tyranny of the paraphrase. We were all encouraged to paraphrase poems as proof, as testimony that we'd understood them. So the question was never, what is the poet saying? Or what is this experience of a poem about? What is this experience of a poem for you? The question was always, what is the poet trying to say? The assumption being that the poet can't say it, he's too dumb to say it. So he has to express his fuzzy, incoherent self in bits of verse, and you, the brainy one, transpose that into 3 sensible paragraphs, which you hand into your examiner, and that's what you get your marks for. So there again, the assumption is really that the poem has to be about something. The poem cannot just be what it is, which is this absolutely inseparable cocktail of form and content. Here you're actually encouraged to extract the content and leave behind the carcass of the form, and it's believed that you've cracked the poem. Frequently it means you haven't got it at all. So I go back to that 13-year-old moment when I had no idea who this man was or this woman was, but the poems were alive, the poems were molten, and I remember recognizing that. Many years later I started writing poetry. I kept some and I threw away many, which was as it should be. And I discovered other things that I enjoyed about the form. I realized, yes, of course it is about self-expression. I realized that it is the shortest, most direct verbal route to the self that I know. I realized that it is possible to have all kinds of alchemy with poetry. You can start out writing a rage poem, and by the end of it you end up somewhere else altogether, somewhere where you never anticipated. All this I recognized as the magic of it. I realized that it was about not just expression, it was also about discovery. It was not just about self-revelation, it was also about composition. It was as much about making as it was about discovery. All kinds of discoveries that I think many of us make as writers, as practitioners of verse, or even as readers of verse in some way. And then I'd like to just come to my last moment, because that for me has been significant. It happened around March '97. There are different ways to talk about that experience. But strangely enough for me, it was catalyzed entirely accidentally by a visit to Kathmandu. So I'm going to think about how I will talk about it today. I was actually returning from Nepal. That's when it happened. And for me, for now, let me just say that it seemed like I tumbled headlong into one of those blank spaces on a page of poetry. And I realized that there are just vast, vast areas of my inner self that cannot be mapped by language at all. It was the most humbling realization that poetry, more than any other verbal art, is about silences. And you just have to make your peace with those silences in some way, or attempt to try to make your peace. Perhaps you'll never make it. That for me was a turning point. And I think really since '97, something changed in the way I looked, not just at myself, but certainly in the way I look at poetry. I think I felt the need to decongest language much more. I felt the need to be more consciously porous, more perforated, more accepting of all these holes, all these gaping craters, which actually exist on a page of poetry. But it took me forever and a day to realize that the actual voltage of a poem lies in those gaps. It took me forever to realize that the octane of a poem, the spine of a poem, lies in those silences. So I think my poetry is a little more open to bewilderment now than it was. And if I were to just sum this up, and maybe we can throw this open to conversation after this, I'll just say that I really do believe increasingly that we seem to live in times when we're confronted time and again by two approaches, largely, to language. There is a culture of terminal certainty about everything. And then there's the culture of terminal triviality. And somewhere between the two, somewhere between the verdict and the fluffy soundbite, I believe poetry offers us a way. It offers us a way to be provisional, a way to accommodate uncertainty. There's really no other form that compels you to confront punctuation in certain ways that poetry does. You're not allowed to get seduced by the full stop, which I think many of us do get beguiled by in our lives. Poetry compels you to live with question marks, with commas, with hyphens, with pauses, great gaping pauses. Rilke has a line about this. He says, he talks about the news that's always arriving out of silence. I think there is. And we all heard distant strains of that news at one point or the other, but there's really no form like poetry that embraces the possibility of that news as much as poetry does. I once called it the art of the murmured voice. We live in a culture of such noise that sometimes it feels, especially if you're on Facebook long enough, it sometimes feels like all you hear are people blaring their achievements at each other, more than anything else. And somewhere along the way, one begins to wonder, there is an anxiety, I think, that this can produce. And you realize that there is an option. You have an option to outshout the rest, and there are lots of mechanisms available now to outshout. But there is another option, and that option is really to drop your voice and keep the faith that you will still be heard. Poetry for me is an attempt to keep that faith. Thank you so much.
As we now open the floor, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask her, or anything you would like to add on to.
And it doesn't have to be a question. If there's anything that you'd like to share, any particular encounter with a poem perhaps, or anything at all that you'd like to share, observations are welcome too.
Especially because I see a lot of poets in the audience.
That's good to know. That's good to know.
Can you share with us one of your poems or a few?
A short one maybe? Is that or shall I share my Bombay poem with you? How about that? A Bombay poem? How many have several of you actually been to that crazy city? No? Okay, then not a Bombay. Okay, an invitation to Bombay. Okay? This is a poem called Where I Live. And it's about my absolutely conflicted, very, very mixed feelings about living in that city. I keep threatening to leave it, and now that I'm actually out of it a good deal of the time, I'm nostalgic. Where I live. I live on a wedge of land, reclaimed from a tired ocean, somewhere at the edge of the universe. Greetings from this city of L'Oreal sunsets and diesel afternoons, deciduous with concrete, botoxed with vanity. City of septic magenta hair clips, of garrulous sewers and tight-lipped taps, of 80s film tunes buzzing near the left temple, of ranting TV soaps and monsoon melodramas. City wrapped by hope and bulimia. City uncontained by movie screen and epigram. City condemned to unspool in an eternal hysteria of lurid nylon dream. City where you can drop off a swollen local and never be noticed. City where you're a part of every English-soaked bhel puri. City of the Mahalakshmi beggar peering up through a gorse bush of splayed limbs. City of dark alleys. City of mistrust. City of forsaken, tube-lit rooms. City that coats the lungs, stiffens the spine, chills the gut with memory. City suspended between flesh and mortar and full leather and delirium, where it is perfectly historical to be looking out on a sooty handkerchief of ocean, searching for God.
You talked about difficulties of finding a mainstream publisher for poetry in South Asian English writing, for writers of English. In your case, how difficult was it? I think you are published by Penguin. To get it published by Penguin.
Actually,
poetry in English.
Yes, and my poetry hasn't been published by Penguin. My prose has. So the non-fiction I've done has been published by Penguin. Poetry continues to remain difficult. I've actually been published by a publisher in the UK, Blood Axe, but in India, it continues to be a problem because Penguin still doesn't have a regular agenda for poetry. Very few publishers do. HarperCollins tries, but given the situation, it's difficult. It's difficult. There are smaller publishers, journals, smaller literary journals, editors of those journals who seem to spearhead one, small, somewhat precarious ventures. One never knows how long they last, but there are some brave efforts. Apart from that, no. Is it the same here? Is it pretty much?
Same.
Yes.
So I think he can, Mr. Sigdal, poet, he can tell better than me.
It's almost the same situation here. I don't think I would. Since 2000 we have
formed a group of Nepali writers in English. And there is a platform where we meet every month, recite our creative writings, especially poetry. And then we have a literary journal called Off Nepalese Clay, which we have already published 20 volumes of poetry. Which I think means, I was talking to Abhayji that is the only literary journal published in English from Nepal.
Is that right?
Yeah. So, and then
That's
talk about...
That's a quarterly?
No, it's
annual.
No, it's biannual, means once in 6 months. And then means it's always difficult to find publishers for Nepali poetry, and so English audiences are can imagine.
Yes.
So it has been always a very difficult thing. But it's, I think, a matter of prestige that at least few people are writing in English, and then yeah, there are a few poets who are doing well. But in terms of readership or in terms of people who buy poetry book, means I was talking to one of the booksellers in Kathmandu, and he says, please don't appear if you are coming to talk about putting your poetry book into my bookstore. No, you are not allowed. So poets are not allowed. I mean, that's the statement that he made, and I think that that's what speaks of the truth about poetry, even here in Kathmandu. We share the same situation. And I think it's almost the same in this subcontinent.
Yes, and actually in many cultures of the world, people recognize each other because of subtle ways in which, please, did you want to leave? Oh. Subtle ways in which poetry can be just marginalized. I think poets recognize each other all over the world for that reason, really. It's a pretty, we're in pretty much a similar situation in many, many parts of this country and of this world. Yes.
Thanks a lot for your very wonderful ideas, very exciting to listen. I sometimes try to write poems, poetry. I find it very difficult to compose. I'm always interested to write down in English language, but most often my raw materials becomes politics rather than the subject. I'm really wondering, like, when I write a poetry and then recite it before my friends, and they think it's very difficult to understand. What have you written about? It's tough to make a sense.
Yes, I know.
And then when I explain them, the area I have covered and my intention of expression, oh, then it is wonderful. So my point here is, the crisis, what I can see is, for the readers, it's very difficult to make out the meaning. Because to me, what I want to do is, I want to deviate, like every poet does, from the normal use of language. So it becomes so much symbolic, and the readers might not be able to identify the symbol that is targeted to. That is a challenge. Once people find it difficult to make out meaning, and it will be really less interesting or no interesting at all. Just the appearances of the words and sounds when you read it out. Another thing I find it very difficult is the form. I do not follow any form. I just write down in my own way, and I'm not pretty sure whether that's the right form of the poetry, whether it is acceptable in the academic community or the community of the poetry writers.
I think those are two very significant questions.
That's my sharing of my
Yes, I'm so glad
experience.
you did. Because this business about poetry being difficult, I think we're saddled with for life. We're going to always encounter it. I'd say particularly if you're writing, I do other kinds of writing as well. I write non-fiction. But I found that there is this particular kind of writing that calls for prose. This is something that needs to be said in prose. I want it to be communicated in precise precisely this particular way, and prose seems to be the right medium for it. But I don't at all intend to suggest by that poetry is imprecise and prose is precise. Poetry requires as much precision, if not more, than prose. It is the province of mystery, and it is also the province of clarity. It's both. So it's the space where craft and creativity go hand in hand. Craft is not a dirty word at all in poetry. Both these go very much hand in hand. It's as much about passion as it is about precision. I think this is something that we often forget, or young people, I think, often forget at 14 and 15, when you feel you need to splatter yourself. I have. Splatter yourself on a page. And I felt deeply, therefore it's a poem. It doesn't have to be a poem. It could be something you share with your lover or your friend, but it's not necessarily a poem. So I think that's one thing perhaps that I still try to remember. The other thing I'd say is a line from Randall Jarrell, the American poet and critic that's always inspired me. He says, it's not that people have stopped reading modern poetry because it's difficult. It's because people have stopped reading modern poetry that they find it difficult. I think there is a deep truth in that. And that's why I mentioned that third moment, the T.S. Eliot moment. You talked about symbolic, writing that's deeply symbolic. There is really no one other than Eliot. I mean, in many ways he seems to represent the epitome of language that's coded and layered on multiple levels. Many years later, as a student of literature, I approached him armed with casebook and dictionary and decoded him, I thought. But when I related to him at 13, I had none of that. And it was still possible to know that one was in the presence of poetry. So I think it's also about keeping the faith that a poem has an ability to reach out, maybe not on all the levels that you would like the person to pick up. Perhaps it won't happen right away. But poetry is a dark art. It leaks into lives. It's not something we go away with and say, my life has changed because I read this poem. But actually, that's the way it works. That's the kind of guile that a poem has. It seeps into your marrow and you are changed at the end of it without you even knowing it's happened.
Thank you very much, Arundhathi, for your eloquent expression. I have read an Israeli poet who says that all poetry is political. Do you agree with this?
I think it's a valid definition, actually. I do think it's a valid definition. I think insofar as, I belong to also, I grew up with my old feminist Marxist upbringing, is very much one that encouraged me to believe that the personal was the political. So I certainly agree with that. Perhaps what I'm uncomfortable with is any attempt to underscore a point in an effort to be self-consciously political. I'm not even against being self-consciously political, but sometimes the language of advertising, when that creeps into poetry, which is propaganda, advertising just being one kind of propaganda, this being another, I think that can sometimes just make for tedious writing. Which is not, I really believe eventually there are two kinds of poems. There are good poems and there are bad poems, And you could write a poem that seems marvelous to you as a pamphlet, but perhaps it's not effective poetry. Equally, one could write a marvelous love letter and it needn't to be poetry. So I think it's important to remember really that this is the fundamental distinction for me, good poetry and bad. You could write a good political poem, and you could write a bad political poem.
Thank you. It was a really great kind of ideas we got, and we were really overwhelmed by your ideas and experience. So I have my questions about, there are different forms of poetry, and those poetry, for example, the forms are sometimes sequence, sometimes haiku, sometimes sonnet. And when you try to write a kind of a poetry in haiku, you have always conscious about the syllables, no? 575 or something like that. Don't you think it will constrain the poet's expression? And which form do you prefer to write, free verse or kind of a form?
It's a good question again, and it goes back to his second question, so I'm so glad you asked it, because I didn't get around to answering that. You know, I really think whether you write free verse or whether you write in a fixed form, the challenges are the same. Both are equally challenging. Free verse is not self-indulgence. You know, it's not just becoming a kind of amoeba, verbal amoeba. That's not free verse, you know? Just flabbiness is not. A lot of flabby writing masquerades as free verse. You know, that's just bad writing. The attempt really is to be vigilant, to be conscious of why your line ends where it does. You know, and when I talked about the silences on a page, it's also about acknowledging why that silence is, that might well propel you in a particular direction. So you may think that in fact you needed to write a sonnet and you may end up with free verse. That's possible. But in both cases, you know, rigor is an essential part of poetry. It's also, I don't even see it as, you know, as kind of dreary hard work. It's the pleasure of writing. You know, it's like being in a workshop with your sleeves rolled up, you know, surrounded by words. That's the craftsmanship, the excitement of poetry is that. Being around words, feeling them, tasting them, looking at textures, choosing a word, tossing it aside, coming up with another. That's the excitement of poetry. You know, so I think irrespective of form, that holds. Rigor holds. Rigor is crucial for poetry. And yet, let me just undercut all that I said by saying, you know, that earlier bit about mystery, that also holds good. So at the best of times, I sometimes think poetry is a kind of inspired eavesdropping. But that happens only after the craft is very much something you grapple with.
Any more questions we have?
Yes. Did you ask? No, I think the lady behind you. No? Oh.
Let me conclude with a question that I have for you. In general, I mean, how difficult it is as a writer in general to distinct yourself from your writing and to the life that you live around. Because sometimes, like for example, you're expressing all the emotions out in a poem or in form of a prose or a fiction. But sometimes the reality is, or many a times, the reality is completely difficult, completely different. So are you living a two different kinds of lives? One into your writing and one around yourself?
That's such a profound question that it might take the evening to answer. But, you know, let me say this. You know, when I talked about tumbling into those blank spaces on a page of poetry, for me that was a realization that I couldn't live a double life anymore. You know? What do I mean by that? I mean that I had been tripped up. I had been derailed. So all my attempts at seeing myself as a manipulator of language were punctured, they were deflated. So it, for me, opened up another whole way of looking. I saw myself much more as a seeker than a poet. So I think those boundaries started blurring more, I was more aware of that blurring after that. But I wanted to say one thing in response to both your questions. You know, it's when you work with a form and when you work with free verse, what you're trying to do when you work within a fixed form is you're trying to find your freedom within the parameters of the form. And when you're with free verse, you're trying to evolve your form in a situation of freedom. Both take effort and both involve, thankfully, excitement. You know, but they're not so different. Is that permissible to have returned to that question?
Definitely. Thank you so much once again for being with us in such a short notice. We haven't, however, yet formally introduced her. Can we have a big round of applause for Arundhathi Subramanaiam. She's a poet, writer on spirituality and culture. She has worked over years as a poetry editor, curator, and journalist on literature, classical dance, and theatre. Arundhathi Subramanaiam is the author of 3 books.
We'll have the generator within a minute.
Poetry is certainly a dark art. That's right.
Welcome to Nepal. Load sharing. That was part of our daily lives, so we're quite used to it. Arundhathi Subramanaiam is the author of 3 books of poems, most recently, Where I Live, New and Selected Poems. Her prose works include the best-selling biography of a contemporary mystic and a book on the Buddha. As editor, she has worked on a penguin anthology of essays on sacred journeys in the country, Pilgrims, India, and co-edited a penguin anthology of contemporary Indian love poems in English, Confronting Love. She has traveled extensively across the world to participate in the literary conferences and festivals, and her work has been translated into several languages, including Hindi, Tamil, Italian, and Spanish. A recipient of the prestigious Raja Award for Poetry 2009, as well as the Charles Wallens Fellowship in 2003, the Visiting Arts Fellowship for Poetry Tour of the UK in 2006, and the Homi Bhabha Fellowship in 2012. Arundhathi Subramanaiam also edited the Indian domain of the Poetry International Web, which grew into a significant web journal of contemporary Indian poetry. She has worked at the National Centre for the Performing Arts NCPA, Mumbai, for several years, leading a discussion-based inter-arts forum named Chauraha. She has also been head of Indian classical dance at the NCPA. She has written on literature, classical dance, theatre and culture for various newspapers, including the Times of India, the Hindu, the Indian Express, among many others. Once again, we thank you so much for being with us in this 8th edition of Voices on such a short notice, straight away from the Trivandrum International Airport. She's been with us. May I now kindly request Mr. Abhay Kumar, Head of Press Information and Culture and Secretary of People and India-Nepal Foundation, to kindly present a token of appreciation.
Maybe you could conclude with a recitation of the poem.
Yes. Quick short poem, because I know you all have to go home, and I remember Kathmandu traffic jams being legendary. Are they? Yes. They still are. That's what I remember from '97. This is just a small poem called Home. I'm not sure whether it's because I live in a subcontinent like we all do, that's constantly being reminded of its ancient heritage, but there are times when I've wanted a sense of belonging that doesn't feel weighed down by history. Home. Give me a home that isn't mine, where I can slip in and out of rooms without a trace, never worrying about the plumbing, the color of the curtains, the cacophony of books by the bedside. A home that I can wear lightly, where the rooms aren't clogged with yesterday's conversations, where the self doesn't bloat to fill in the crevices. A home like this body, so alien when I try to belong, so hospitable when I decide I'm just visiting. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you all of you for being with us here today, patiently waiting for the program to begin. Please join us for the refreshments before you leave. Thank you.